Well, welcome to the Australian National University. My name is Hilary Charlesworth and I work here in the area of international law. And I'm delighted this morning to be welcoming Dr Anne Gallagher to talk to us. Anne is, among many other qualities, she is a graduate of the ANU and we're extremely proud of her, as you're going to discover. Well, Anne, welcome and thank you very much for coming along.
Thanks, Hilary.
I wanted to start with your very exciting recent award. Just this year, you were named by the United States Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, as one of the trafficking in persons in people heroes. Now, can you tell us, I know this is a very special award, can you tell us a little bit about what the award is? And I'd also like to ask you, what was it like to meet Hillary Clinton?
Okay, well, I'll go to the award first. Since the early 1990s, the US has been producing this comprehensive report on trafficking in persons, where it controversially examines and evaluates every country in the world on their response to trafficking, and basically marks them out of three grades you can get: very good, encouraging, and a fail. And to the fail grades is attached a sanctions regime, so it's actually quite a significant international tool in this battle against trafficking. Anyway, a few years ago, the US State Department, as part of this, decided to attach to the report these awards for people who are working, as they say, on the front line against trafficking, slavery, and related exploitation. And I was nominated as one of those people for this year. So it meant that I went to Washington, and I think the best part of that was actually meeting the other awardees, people I think who truly are heroes in very much the classic sense of the word, people who are just, working with victims of trafficking, who are exposing horrific abuses, who are really putting their lives on the line in a number of cases. So I was with them for a week, and it was part of a study tour that was also organised by the US government, and it culminated in this very official ceremony that involved Hillary Clinton and some celebrities as well, some other celebrities, and it was very nice. And meeting Hillary Clinton, of course, it was a great honour for me. She's really been working on this issue for a very long time, right back when I started working on trafficking, so that's almost 2 decades ago now. She was leading the President's Interagency Council on Women. So she was really at the beginning of this international exposure of the problem of trafficking and related exploitation, and she knows it very well, and I think it's very close to her heart.
So Anne, that's a nice lead into my next question, which was, can you tell us a bit about your own work in the area of trafficking? You've said that you've been doing it over the last 2 decades, but can you describe for us a little bit how that began? And I know that you really, the award was given for your work most recently that you've been doing with respect to Southeast Asia, but could you take us from the beginning of your work in the United Nations and then take us to the contributions that you've made in the more recent period?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. In the late 1990s, I was at the UN. I was a legal officer at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and I'd been there for, I think, 6 or 7 years by that time. And Mary Robinson was appointed the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the former President of Ireland. And when she came in, I think a lot of things changed, and some new issues that had previously been ignored really came to the fore. Fairly early on in her tenure, the High Commissioner decided that she was going to make trafficking. And when we talked about trafficking back then, we were very much looking at the sexual exploitation of women and girls, usually migrant women and girls in prostitution. It was a very narrow conception of the problem. But she went to Cambodia and to countries of Eastern Europe and decided that this was going to be a priority for her. She appointed me her special advisor on that issue. And that happened at a wonderful time, really, because at the same time, in another part of the UN member states had decided to develop this Convention on Transnational Organised Crime, the first convention of its kind in the world, and to attach to that convention another treaty on trafficking in persons. So we were able to be involved in the drafting of that. We were able to push very hard to make sure that this wasn't just a crime control approach to trafficking, but that we were going to place the trafficked person right at the centre and their rights right at the centre of the response as far as we could. And we worked very hard on that, and the High Commissioner was extremely supportive and really took a great leadership role. And that treaty was adopted. I think it's different to what it could have been if her office hadn't been involved to the extent that it was. And she continued this work. I was put in charge by her of developing these UN principles and guidelines on human rights and human trafficking, and they were developed in 2002 and have really shaped the international response to trafficking in a very important way, and also shaped how states have responded to trafficking through their national laws and policies.
Can I just stop you there? Can you just explain for us, to take a little more time to explain for us, what was, if I can call it that, the old approach, and what was the approach that you developed? How would you describe those?
Well, a lot of it's got to do with what we mean when we talk about trafficking. So trafficking's got a long history in international law and policy. It was really, the first treaties on trafficking date back to the beginning of the last century, way before many other human rights issues had come to the fore. But really right up until the turn of this century, so till 2000 when this trafficking protocol was adopted, trafficking was generally considered to refer to the movement of women and girls into situations of exploitative prostitution. That was it. And with this new treaty came a new definition, which has a very long, many elements in the legal definition, but basically it means moving or maintaining a person in a situation of exploitation that they can't escape from. So this has really expanded our understanding of what trafficking is and the international prohibition enormously, because it's not just about women and girls in prostitution anymore. It brings in forced and exploitative labour, it brings in forced marriage, it brings in child labour. There are a whole range of contemporary exploitative practices that previously were at the margins of international law and really had almost no regulation attached to them, that are now part and parcel of this fairly strong and evolving legal system.
And taking us to perhaps the last decade in your work, I think sometime after the adoption of this new treaty, you decided to leave the UN and you came to head up a special project in Southeast Asia. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, I ended up leaving the UN after 12 years, and it was a wonderful 12 years, but the High Commissioner's tenure had come to an end, and I felt like I'd done such interesting and important work that I wanted to take it a little bit further in another direction. And I was asked to, as you said, to lead this Australian initiative. So it was actually funded by the Australian government's aid agency, AusAid, and it was to try and strengthen the criminal justice response to human trafficking in Southeast Asia. And this happened at a very interesting time because Australia itself at that point was not recognising the existence of a problem of trafficking. The Australian government was actually very firm that this was a problem that they recognised, but only in relation to other countries, that it didn't exist in Australia. We've come to realise and to recognise over the last decade that that actually wasn't the case, and certainly isn't the case now. But what it meant was that the Australian government was committed to putting quite substantial resources into this initiative, and it's gone on in various phases over the last decade. It's the largest criminal justice intervention in the world on trafficking in persons. It's basically been working to strengthen the legal framework in all of the ASEAN countries of Southeast Asia, and then to work with the criminal justice system, so with law enforcement, prosecutors and the judiciary, to make sure that the criminal justice system is, first of all, ending impunity, because this is a crime that's low risk and high profit, so to change those odds, but also to use the criminal justice system to secure justice for victims through compensation, through making sure that they are able to actually escape from their exploiters and go back to or create a life for themselves that that is much better than the one that they left.
So what type of resistance do you meet in, for example, trying to strengthen the criminal system in a number of countries? I imagine that it's not a straightforward process. So not to name any countries, but can you tell us about some of the barriers? I guess the fact also it's funded by the Australian government might lead some countries perhaps to be rather cautious or suspicious about what they might see as intervention. I don't know if these are issues, but I'd be interested in your reflections.
Yeah, I think one of the project's been very successful on any of the very complex measures that AusAid has required us to follow. And when I look at why we've managed to achieve what we have, I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that the project is seen very much as a technical resource by the ASEAN member states. So, for example, when I was put in charge of the project, I was able to recruit really the best people in the world. I wasn't restricted to Australia, so we have a multi-nationality team. I managed to get who I believe is the best investigator, one of the people who really led the initiation of this particular type of investigation. I managed to get one of the leading prosecutors from the US to come and join our team. We've got lawyers, many other police who actually are really specialists at their job, and that's helped. I don't think that the ASEAN countries actually look at, it's called the RTIP project, as a purely Australian initiative. They see it as something that is very technical and highly professional, and they judge it on that basis. But what you said, of course, there are huge problems, and I think they're both macro and then problems that are more specific to countries. So if we take the bigger picture first, we have to face the fact that trafficking continues, this kind of exploitation continues because it's in many people's interests to allow it to continue. And that also happens at the government level. I think some governments, we have to acknowledge that some governments derive benefit from an unregulated, unprotected migrant labour force that can be moved on if circumstances permit. And we saw that during the Asian financial crisis, where whole populations of migrant workers who'd been tolerated for a long time in these countries were just very suddenly kicked out. And then we also have to accept that in some countries the remittances that come from migrant labour are so important to keeping governments in power, actually. And some would argue perhaps keeping the population from rising up against incompetence and corruption and these kinds of things that we see. So while they, of course, don't want their citizens to be harmed, they're willing to tolerate a certain level of exploitation in that exported migrant sector, just because they don't want to upset the apple cart too much. And if we look at prostitution, I think that a number of countries are pretty happy with a situation where they can condemn prostitution and exploitation in prostitution, but also maintain a prostitution industry in the country that's comprised principally of exploited foreigners. So we have those bigger political issues where governments, in a way, are torn. They want to do something. They actually don't want their citizens to be exploited, and they don't want to be a site of exploitation. But at the same time, there are these tensions. And then, of course, when you're working with criminal justice systems, trafficking, in a way, can be a bit of a Trojan horse to get into criminal justice systems. We've had very long established relationships with our counterparts, and they do trust us. So it means that we can work with them and also not just help them on trafficking, but because we're working in the criminal justice system, we can help them to develop or to improve other parts of the system. So in some countries, for example, our work on trafficking has led to changes in the evidence laws, changes in the way suspects are treated, changes in the way that victims are treated generally throughout the system. But it's definitely not easy. I think that in many places where trafficking is really a problem, the criminal justice systems are just not up to the challenge of investigating and prosecuting these kinds of problems properly.
And how does one also deal with the issue that a lot of the issue of trafficking that you're describing is, as you've just said, a result really of economic pressures? So in a sense, one might say, well, because there are economic benefits in these, people might even apparently willingly put themselves in a position where they are involved in exploitation because they desperately need money. What are the ways that we can deal with that, and of what efficacy is the criminal justice system in dealing with those deeper rooted economic issues?
I think that's always a problem, and it's a tension, and there's long been a belief that a criminal justice response to trafficking and a human rights response are somehow incompatible. You either have one or the other. I've come to believe that that's really a false dichotomy, and that they need to be together, that it's not going to work otherwise. And of course we have situations where, very real situations, where people are, as you said, putting up with what on any measure would be ruthless exploitation from our perspective, but it's better than the alternative. And this is, I think, even some contemporary cases that have come to light in Australia illustrate this. I guess from a criminal justice point of view, the way that we do our work is to emphasise that we have to look at whether a crime has been committed. And the perspective of the victim is extremely important, particularly in terms of how they're going to be dealt with, how they're going to be supported after after they've been identified as such. But in terms of working out whether someone has exploited another human being, we have to be objective and say, even if a debt contract is something that the exploited person is willing to live with, if it's an illegal debt contract, that has to be dealt with. If someone is exploiting another person and making money out of that, we can't just step aside because the person who's being exploited is of the belief, which may be quite genuine, that they're better off there than somewhere else. So it's really walking a line and accepting that there's not just one response. It's not possible to just decide that we're going to prosecute traffickers or just decide that we're going to look after the victims. It's something that these things need to happen simultaneously and towards a common goal.
And you have worked in the international human rights system for most of your professional life, and I'm wondering, at a time when that system seems under threat, it's highly criticised, what are your views on the value of the international human rights system?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, because I think my views of not of human rights, not of the essence of human rights, but how human rights can best be advanced have perhaps evolved over time. I was very much a human rights purist when I was at the United Nations, and working on human rights, I think there's a tendency to, one can become righteous fairly easily and believe that one has the monopoly of knowledge in what is correct. And perhaps the last decade of working on the front line, and particularly with people like police and judges and prosecutors who hold individual rights in their power so directly and so immediately, has shifted my views somewhat. And I think that there are so many different ways of approaching human rights, and I'm not sure, probably the best example to give you, I'm not sure that many of the counterparts that I work with actually know I'm a human rights lawyer. But everything I do, everything I teach, everything that I promote is grounded very much in the idea of human rights. So if we're working with them on how they're dealing with victims of trafficking or how they're dealing with suspects, the human rights approach is right at the centre, but it's not necessarily always the language of human rights that we're going to use. But looking at the bigger picture, I think that working on the issue of trafficking has really renewed my faith in the human rights system in many ways, because when I did start working on this issue, as I said, these kinds of practices were really at the periphery. If they were discussed at all within the human rights system, they belonged to a working group of the main human rights body within the UN. They just weren't important and they weren't talked about. And this has changed radically. It's not possible for countries anymore to say that forced labour or bonded labour or forced marriage or exploitative working conditions are just a matter for themselves. That's not actually accepted anymore. And for me, that's a huge change, which in human rights terms really changes the rules of the games fundamentally.
And to finish up then, I think perhaps a lot of ANU students who might be listening to you today would be really interested in your own career, because you started out as somebody with a law degree, with indeed 2 law degrees from Australia, the first from Macquarie and the second from the ANU. And it'd be very interesting for you just to recount in an autobiographical way, first of all, where your interest in the international system developed, first of all, and secondly, how you actually made it into working inside the United Nations, and whether you have any tips or guidance to young people who might be interested in such a career path.
Okay, I'm not sure if my career path was the most orthodox one. I studied law at an undergraduate level, and it was really only in my 4th year of law school where I started to study international law that I felt that I was doing the right thing. Law itself, the big picture of law, had never interested me as much. And then I think everything was very clear for me from then on. I came to ANU because at that time that was the only law school that was offering postgraduate studies in international law, and I was very happy here at ANU. It was the first time I met you, and you were doing such wonderful work on gender in international law, which was back then, and I'm sure you remember so well, was just so radical and exciting, and really turning the old international law on its head in a way that was much bigger even perhaps than the particular lens that you were looking through. So it was just, it was wonderful to be here at ANU and to be doing that study. And then I was lucky enough to move into the law faculty and to actually be teaching international law. And I think nothing would have moved me from there, because I've always been very much attached to academia, except for this job at the UN. And I was asked to sit for these national competitive examinations, and these are held every couple of years in countries that are considered to be underrepresented within the UN system. And I got through those and got sent to the country that was on the bottom of my list of preferences, which was Switzerland, and took it from there. So, and I was very happy. I think the experience at the UN was quite difficult in many senses. It's a very strange bureaucracy to work in, and it had its great challenges, but being able to work with Mary Robinson was wonderful. But I am very glad that I had a permanent job at the UN, and I could very well still be there, but I'm very happy that I decided at a certain point that I wanted to move into a new direction, because working in international development, taking those skills of international diplomacy that I learnt and my love of international law to the front line, I think has been great for me personally, and it's really expanded my understanding and appreciation of how law can be used. And I think these might even be your words, to put words in the mouths of the powerless. I've seen that really in action, and that's a wonderful thing, and something that I would urge anyone who's interested in helping to change people's lives and change the inequalities that are woven into the fabric of our world, to take that sort of inspiration.
Well, Anne, thank you very much for coming along and talking to us at the ANU, and I'm sure that your own story and the much larger story that you've told us here today about the capacity of international law in some contexts to change the type of discourse and the action that's happening and to really make a difference. I think that's a wonderfully inspiring story, and I'm sure it will affect the next generation as well. So thank you very much for coming along.
Thank you, Hilary. It's been a pleasure.